because imagine if someone, I don't know, someone painted a mural of Citrus College students, right? And they only painted white people. Immediately, all the students of color would be like, wait, where are we? Right? So you put the students of color in. Then there are no women in there. The women would say, wait, where are we? We need to be included too. So this is the dynamic at work, whereby we who see ourselves as excluded or other want to be included. And that's what happened here. So they are now a part of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but what they also show is that white, black, and Latino men served and fought in the U.S. Army together. No one would have cared about this in the 1950s or 1940s. There are no memorials to black soldiers in the U.S. Army in the 1940s or 1950s. No one cares. But in 1982, because of what happened in the Vietnam War and the fact that all these soldiers fought together, because of civil rights, black power, brown power, and so on, all of a sudden, the notion of who is on our side in the U.S. military changed. So that you can no longer build a memorial to the U.S. Army that didn't include blacks and Latinos, right? And so this is part of the way that the ethics of recalling our own gradually begins to incorporate others as well. So that now if you make a movie or make a memorial about the U.S. Army, you've got to put in blacks, Latinos, minorities, right? It's unheard of. You wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. That's an indication of how our notion of memory has changed over the past 50 years. Because if you go back and watch John Wayne movies about World War II, he doesn't care about black people. There's no black people in there. Right? But you cannot make a movie today about the U.S. Army without black people in it. It's impossible. So the ethics of recalling others is very important in terms of its capacity to transform how we see ourselves. So nearby, this place in Gardens Road, California, literally on a place called All American Way, you can't even make this up, the Vietnam War Memorial was built in about 2003. And what it depicts is an American soldier and a South Vietnamese soldier standing side by side with the same height under an American flag, a South Vietnamese flag, and the POW MIA flag. And this is the first memorial in the country that includes South Vietnamese veterans. Now obviously when Vietnamese Americans go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, their first reaction is, where are we? There are 58,000 names of dead Americans here. What about, aren't the South Vietnamese who fought also Vietnam veterans? Where are the 250,000 names of the dead South Vietnamese soldiers for whom the United States supposedly fought and for whom they were the Allies? So that issue of not seeing yourself in a memorial is there for all the Southeast Asians who go to that Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The Hmong, the Laotians, the Cambodians, they all go there and like, wait, where are we? Didn't we fight? Didn't we die in this war too? Anti-war people go to that memorial and they're like, where are the 3 million dead Vietnamese names? Aren't they a part of the war too? So memorials always force us to ask who is remembered and who is forgotten, and then compel us to build our own memorials or make our own memories and make our own films, write our own novels, and so on. And so that's what happened here with the Vietnam War Memorial, that the Vietnamese people of Orange County, California raised the funds, did the petitions and so on to build a memorial that showed that the South Vietnamese soldier was an equal comrade with Americans, which tells you its own kind of story about how Vietnamese Americans want to remember their participation in this war. So Vietnamese Americans who experienced themselves as others built memorials to themselves as well. And you can see how important this is. If you go every April 30th, it's the commemoration of the end of the Vietnam War in Orange County. Orange County is home to the most anti-communist, pro-nationalist Vietnamese people in the United States. And you will see men like this dressed up in this way. Many of them really are veterans. Some of them aren't, I guess. But reenacting various kinds of rituals that commemorate their lost country. So just as American veterans want to dress up in their uniforms and medals and get their parades and so on, so do the South Vietnamese veterans as well. So the ethics of recalling others has been, I think, gradually more and more important in the United States when it comes to the Vietnam War. And I think one of the reasons why is because time passes, wounds heal a little bit, people are more willing to talk about people they once considered to be enemies, aliens, or others. So that's why 60 years after the end of World War II, Clint Eastwood is able to make something like Letters from Iwo Jima, right, depicting the Japanese point of view during World War II. In the case of the United States, the effort to recall others on the part of Americans has been a little bit faster. Robert Owen Butler won the Pulitzer Prize in 1991 for his short story collection, Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, which is written purely from the perspective of Vietnamese refugees in the United States. Larry Hyman, who wrote Close Quarters that we just saw, went back to Vietnam and met soldiers that he fought against, North Vietnamese soldiers, and talked about, how he's made peace with these former enemies of his. So the ability to recall others, I think, is one of the reasons why it's an important ethical project, is because it's part of how we reconcile, make peace, move on. And in our current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've not really begun that process yet. We don't have those kinds of stories. And so hopefully we will. I mean, that's part of the capacity for a nation, especially like ours, to be able to understand the past, is to be able to tell stories not only about ourselves, but about the people we fought wars with, against, or on their behalf. And I think it's particularly challenging when those others happen to be others that we see to be really strange because of nation, race, or religion. Which is why Hollywood, for example, was able to make movies featuring German protagonists in World War II a decade or two after World War II ended. But it took 60 years for them to do Letters from Iwo Jima. Why? I think it's race. That racial difference still plays an enormous role in how America sees its others. So I just wanted to give you a few examples of artists who have tried to go beyond these divisive ethics of either seeing people as belonging to our side or the other side. This is probably one of the best known Vietnamese American, Vietnamese diasporic artists around, Dinh Q. Lê. He has a whole series of works like this where what he does is he takes famous pictures, images from the Vietnam War. In this case, this figure here is a character from Apocalypse Now. You've seen the movie. There's a famous scene where these Playboy bunnies are putting on a show for the American soldiers, and one of them is dressed up as a cowboy. That's her. He takes these images and he cuts them apart and he weaves them together with images of Vietnamese people. So here's a close-up of her face and then the face of various kinds of Vietnamese people. He found these photographs in secondhand stores with no names attached. So these are people whose photographs have been lost without attribution. We don't know who they are. And that's part of the dimension of the memorial project that he's engaged in, is to make us think about why it is that we can remember this fractured image of the Playboy bunny from Apocalypse Now, but we can't remember, or it's very hard for us to remember, all of these nameless people who survived as actual people during the period of the war itself. So, just to follow up on what he does, he also extends his work to Cambodia too. And so I think the reason why he does that is because it's very difficult to understand the Vietnam War without understanding the role that Cambodia and Laos played in the war as well. The statistic that you probably heard, that the U.S. dropped more bombs on Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War than on all of Europe during World War II, is true, except for the fact that most of those bombs were dropped on Laos and Cambodia. Right? And the reason why is because the U.S. was North Vietnam was sending troops to those countries, to South Vietnam, troops and supplies, and the U.S. was trying to interdict and stop that. And by doing that, both Vietnam and the United States were responsible for pulling Laos and Cambodia into this conflict, and to the tune of, I can't remember, 100,000 Laotians died, I think, during this time period, and 700,000 Cambodians died during this time period. And many historians argue that the bombing of Cambodia, the severity of that bombing, destabilized Cambodian society, enabled the rise of the Khmer Rouge among the Cambodian peasantry, and directly contributed then, after 1975, to the Khmer Rouge taking over Cambodia and enacting a genocidal regime that killed 1.7 million people more. So is that a part of the Vietnam War? Is that something that we need to talk about and to address? Vietnamese people don't want to talk about it. That complicates their story. Americans don't want to talk about it because it implicates the United States in what happened in Cambodia. But again, part of why I started off with this idea of the war story is to then get us to this point where we see how limited the idea of the Vietnam War story actually is and why it precludes us talking about events that happened before and after the war and outside of Vietnam. Because all of those things would complicate our understanding of the Vietnam War. Do we end at 12:50 or do we end now?
12:55.
12:55, okay. And I'll still try to take questions and have more conversation afterwards. But the efforts to talk about both sides or more than one side is happening not just in the United States or among Vietnamese Americans, but in certain parts of Vietnamese society too. So this book was a very important book. It's the diary of Dr. Chum, who was a North Vietnamese doctor who volunteered to go to war. She was part of this generation in North Vietnam who really saw themselves as engaged in a war of patriotic liberation and reunification. They saw the French and the Americans as enemies, as invaders, who had to be kicked out at all costs. They really believed in what they were doing. And part of the way that the war for the Vietnamese was different than the United States is because not only were civilians involved, but women were involved too. So in the Vietnamese armies of all sides, women were an active component. So she volunteered to go fight in the South, or she volunteered to be a doctor in the South, and she was eventually killed by American soldiers at a young age. And the Americans took her diary. And the American officer who took her diary kept it with him. This is not uncommon. Kept it with him, and then in around early 2000s, made an effort to try to find her family, to give the diary back to her. And this was eventually published then in Vietnam. It became a big bestseller. She really became symbolic to a later generation of the earlier generation's sacrifice and patriotism. But in the book, she has no good words for Americans. She calls them pirates, invaders, barbarians, things like this. But in the movie that was made from her book by Viet Nguyen, who was Vietnam's premier director of the revolutionary generation, the movie's called Don't Burn, he decided to incorporate the story of the American officer who found the diary, right? So it's a very important film because Viet Nguyen became famous for making movies that extolled the Vietnamese perspective, North Vietnamese perspective on the war. And then in his most recent film, he thought it would be important to show both sides of the conflict as well. And I think in that way, ironically, Vietnam has done more to talk about the perspectives of Americans than Americans have done to talk about the perspectives of the Vietnamese. Because you still don't see a major Hollywood movie that would do what Viet Nguyen tried to do by giving equal screen time to both Americans and Vietnamese. But we brought him out to USC and he said, well, we released this movie on the same weekend in Vietnam that Transformers 2 came out. So Transformers 2 crushed us. You know, it was a truck and we were a bicycle. And I think that's an important thing to point out because, again, go back to the idea that memories simply aren't things that we think about. The memories are things that we produce and we export and we circulate. Memories are commodities. Memories are products. So memories exist and operate on an unequal playing field. Americans still have an advantage on the industrial side of exporting and producing different kinds of memories. So let me just give you an example of the industry of memory, but from a perspective that you probably don't know anything about. How many of you know that there were Koreans in Vietnam? 1, 2, 3, 4. Handful, right? The United States' largest ally in Vietnam was the South Korean Army. The United States brought in 300,000 South Korean troops to fight for them. And they paid the South Korean government a lot of money for those troops. And they also contracted with many South Korean corporations to provide services for Americans and South Koreans in Vietnam. Companies like Daewoo and Hyundai, for example. In this time, South Korea was as poor as Vietnam. But many historians argue that it's because of American payments to South Korea and the transformation of the South Korean corporations that went to Vietnam that we see the rise of the South Korean economy to what it is today. This is part of the history of the Vietnam War that doesn't get talked about because what it indicates is that the Vietnam War was not simply a war against communism fought in one country or even three countries. It was a war about global capital interests and ideologies in which a country like South Korea became really important because South Korea became the positive example of the Vietnam War. Look what happens when you fight with the Americans rather than against the Americans, is the lesson to be gleaned from what happened in South Korea. So South Korean society able to build the Seoul War Memorial, which is, you would be happy to find this in Washington, D.C. It's that impressive. You won't find anything like it in Vietnam. And it commemorates mostly the Korean War, right? But you go to the memorial, almost all of it is about the Korean War and the conflict between the two Koreas. And you finally get to the Vietnam War exhibit, which is 2 small rooms. And it's not called the Vietnam War exhibit, it's called the Korean Expeditionary Forces exhibit. Because what it commemorates is the fact that after the Korean War, Korea became a country that was going to go out and defend the freedom of others. And so there's a whole list of countries where Korea has sent its expeditionary troops in the same way that the US has sent military aid to other countries. But it's all devoted to the Vietnam War. So we know it's about the Vietnam War. And if you go to the exhibit, it's as bloodless as this. You read the exhibits and it says the South Koreans went, they built villages, they defended the freedom of the Vietnamese, and they came home covered in glory. The end. There are no pictures of dead people dying, anything like that. And yet, if you read the accounts of the Korean troops in Vietnam, written by Americans or by South Vietnamese, they uniformly say the South Koreans were the most terrifying guys on the battlefield. They did horrible, horrible things. Everybody was afraid of them. American soldiers were impressed by the South Korean troops. None of that appears in this exhibit. So, the war itself is very poorly remembered in Korea. It is remembered in many ways, sort of how it's remembered here in the United States, as a war in which Koreans were the victims, that they went to fight for the freedom of others, and that they were traumatized by that war, and no one wants to talk about it outside of that context. So Korean veterans have a very hard time getting their stories heard. And they suffer from similar experiences as American veterans. Unlike American veterans, though, these Korean troops, who were part of a unit that murdered 168 civilians in a small village in central Vietnam, went back to Vietnam and said, we want to build a memorial here. I don't believe any American veterans have tried to do that, as far as I know. So the Korean Vietnamese civilians were like, okay, build a memorial, and we want it to say that you guys murdered these people. And the South Koreans were like, no, 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 if we're paying for the memorial, we're not going to say that. We're going to say that these civilians were killed, but not by whom. And they did that. So the reason I'm bringing this up is just to give you an example of how the question of economics, capital, finance, industry help to shape and determine memories. The Vietnamese do not have the capacity to make Apocalypse Now and send it all over the world. They do not have the capacity to go to Korea and build a memorial. But Koreans and Americans have the capacity to make these kinds of movies and then to put their memorials in someone else's country. Imagine, it's hard to imagine in this country that we would allow some other country to come in and build a memorial on our territory, right? It's a symptom or a sign of political economic inequality that helped to shape and determine these wars, and which also shaped the memories of these wars afterwards too. So I want to end, I think, on turning to Cambodia, which I do think is a part of the long, extended history of the Vietnam War. And to give you an example of these industries of memory, that this is S21 prison. If you ever are a tourist and go to Cambodia, you will go see this prison. It is in Phnom Penh, the capital. It's touted as one of the major tourist sites of the country. 17,000 people entered this prison. About 7 people walked out.
7?
7. They were taken there as enemies of the regime, of the Khmer Rouge regime, tortured in horrible, horrible ways, and killed. So if you go to this museum, it's incredibly, I think, depressing. And you will see these artifacts. People were chained to these beds and tortured, and you see a picture in the back of that happening. And initially, there was a whole map of human skulls in the shape of the country. Now they